today. Whew. Well, I've gotten through my first cup of coffee. I haven't made my second cup yet. I need to do that. We'll do that after we've read the next 2 chapters of Everworld. Search for Senna. You'll notice I got a bookmark. 1 goal met this week at least. So, as always, there is a trigger warning for all kinds of trauma. This group of teenagers does go through a lot. I am not reading ahead, so I don't know what it is for specific chapters. But if there's anything that like really gets at you, now's the time to fortify or leave the live video. So yes, let's get started. There was more to the village than I thought. The architecture wasn't grand or imposing, except for a sort of town hall kind of place that had been built out of whole logs and rose above all the surrounding buildings. 3 piers extended out into the water with a wharf built of tarred split logs. Longshoremen offloaded bundles from the wide-hulled merchant ships. The longshoremen must have been slaves. They were a motley bunch, ranging from blonde, blue-eyed Viking look to smaller, olive-complected men and women to black people, but all with shaved heads. I saw no whipping going on, but a couple of big old Vikings were rowing away, giving mostly superfluous orders and pushing people around. Beyond the primitive docks sat warehouses that also looked like they were built of Lincoln logs. They'd have been right at home in the Old West. Just beyond the far pier and curving away inland was a defensive wall I'd glimpsed earlier. Logs set vertically and cut into sharp points. I guess that it ringed the entire village, but I couldn't see it. I did see a tower, again like something out of an old cavalry movie, except instead of bluecoats carrying Winchesters, there were bowmen pacing around a parapet and looking pretty alert. We headed uphill to the town proper. Here the population became more noticeable. We saw a lot of people. More people than could possibly have fit into the 20 or 30 buildings that comprise the village. And surely this village could not have supported a fleet of ships in its harbor. It was a forest of masts. I counted to 30 and still had counted only a fraction of the ships. For the most part, the men seemed to be engaged in swaggering around, talking in loud voices and clapping one another on the back. Most were armed, but not all were armed alike or dressed alike. After a while, you could start to make out the differences between what had to be officers and ordinary soldiers. The officers wore chainmail shirts. They carried swords with jeweled hilts or gold-scrolled scabbards. Some carried battle axes with carved handles and elaborate heads. They had tall leather boots, more luxuriant furs, better sewn pants. They had attendants, helpers, or whatever you call them, who carried their helmets and axes, squires. The common soldiers wore more simpler clothing and carried simpler weapons. No chainmail, no gold, no engraving. Axes that looked like they came from Kmart instead of a jewelry store. Helmets that could have been banged together out of recycled soup cans. But even the common soldiers were a loud, swaggering, boisterous bunch. No cringing, no saluting, no groveling. None of what my dad would have delicately called military chicken product. I began to notice something else, too. Not all of these Vikings were quite what you think of as Norsemen. Yes, the big, blonde type predominated heavily, but there were Vikings who looked like they'd just come in from South America, Africa, or China. And a lot who looked less easily identifiable mixes of Nordic and Asian, Nordic and African. These were as likely to be officers or as common soldiers, and all had the same swagger, the same haw, haw, haw laugh, same eager, dangerous eyes. Blonde or brown, these were big, strong, muscular, dirty-faced, smelling of sweat and charred meat warriors. They weren't playing dress-up. They weren't putting on an act. These guys killed face to face, axe to axe. Everywhere I looked, I saw nasty scars, missing eyes, ears, hands, and arms. One young Viking, probably no older than me, had a livid scar, a puckered puncture wound on both cheeks. Someone had stuck a sword through this guy's mouth. I felt small, weak. Not something I'm used to feeling, not something I like feeling. The memory of my own terror was still all over me. It popped up out of nowhere. It was attached to other thoughts the way remoras are attached to sharks. Of course, not every man was a warrior. I saw unarmed men as well. Some were richly dressed, maybe businessmen. Others were working. We passed a blazingly hot smithy, open forge aglow, 2 sweaty slaves working a huge bellows while a hairy, shirtless Viking with shoulders like the front end of my old Buick hammered away. Wang, wang, wang. Swords hung from the front of the building in a nice selection of battle axes, but hoops for barrels were on display too, along with nails and woodworking tools. Our guide, or captor, as it was hard to be sure which, led us on past an area where more than a dozen open fires had been reduced to coals. Entire cows, pigs, sheep, and goats were blistered and burning on slowly rotating spits. Vast iron pots bubbled. Fish, some several feet long, others smaller, were sandwiched onto iron grids and suspended above the fire. Maybe 50 women were working at this outdoor kitchen, hustling around like itty-harried bunch of cooks. It was overseen by an immense woman with black hair gathered into pigtails. My wife, our guide said genially. She's very impressive, April said. May I ask her name? She is Gudrun Manbeater. I looked closer and saw the staff she carried, a 5-foot-long piece of skin tree branch. On the end was a double fist-sized knot. I am Thorolf, he added politely, and then he did something that surprised me. Without knowing exactly why, he pulled out a leather pouch and a rough-cut rectangle of thin paper, and he proceeded to roll himself a cigar. Our names, again, in case their oddness may have caused you to forget, are April, Christopher, Jalil, and David. Who is your lord? Thorolf asked as casually if he'd asked what school we attended, but it was a loaded question, a dangerous question, I sensed. We're independent, I said, trying to match his casual tone. Bright blue eyes narrowed at me. He lit the stogie, inhaled, and breathed out a cloud of smoke. You are freemen, not slaves. Freemen, I said. You are not from around here, he said, a statement. No, I said, keeping it simple. Thorolf accepted at least that we wanted to mind our own business and have him mind his. I will arrange for food and drink. King Olaf will send for you when he wishes entertainment. He is in council with the other kings and earls. He led us onto a corral containing 40 or 50 stocky, shaggy horses. There were lean-tos around the perimeter of the corral fence. Most seemed to contain hay and alfalfa for the horses. Some contained what you got from horses after you fed them hay and alfalfa. You stay here, he said, pointing to a decent, clean little shed open on one side. Food will be brought and drink. What is the point of food if there is no drink? He stomped off, blowing clouds of cigar smoke into the frosty air. Tobacco, Jalil said excitedly. It bothered me too, April said, but I didn't think it was the right time to bitch about secondhand smoke. Jalil waved his hand impatiently. Who cares about smoke? The man was smoking tobacco. A Viking! We all stared pretty blankly. I was busy trying to see a line of retreat if things got bad. Tobacco is a New World plant. So is corn and tomatoes. They were stewing up corn and tomatoes back there, none of which any real Viking would have. That's what you focus on? Christopher asked. You focus on tobacco and corn. The man's a living, breathing Viking speaking English and living practically next door to Loki's happy little family, for God's sake. Why wouldn't he have a stogie? It just proves it's not a dream, Gilliel said defensively. I might dream about Vikings, and since I don't speak Nordic, they have to be English-speaking Vikings, but I'm not dumb enough to have a Viking firing up a Panatella. And I don't know why I'd come up with Asian Vikings. Black, maybe. It just proves it's not your dream, April said. Maybe it's my dream, and I just think it's kind of exciting, all these big, burly men and all. A woman appeared quite suddenly, carrying a tray. Without a word, she set it down on the ground and walked away. We took a look at the tray. A loaf of dark bread, a single big bowl of soup, a hunk of rank cheese, 2 deep-cut bowls, 1 water, the other beer, Christopher said, delighted. Hey, maybe this is a dream. My dream. I'm thinking maybe getting faced isn't a great idea, I said. I don't drink. My personal choice. Say what? After the day we've had, this is the best excuse for getting hammered I've ever imagined. He took a deep, defiant swig of the beer and glared at me over the rim. April laughed and took the bowl from him. I'm guessing the drinking age here is about 3, she said. She took a sip and spat it out on the ground. Okay, let's try water. We broke up the bread and wolfed it down. It was excellent. The soup was even better, despite having to dig the chunks out with our fingers. Food is freaking magic, Christopher said. I mean, after a day of hanging around the castle walls being terrorized by insane mythical gods, you need some food. Food and beer, he added, looking defiantly at me again. I calmly took a drink from the water. We heard an explosive guffaw. I spun left and saw Thoroff. He was hysterical. I mean, laughing like he could laugh himself to death. Tears streamed down his streak. We'd made the man cry twice in an hour. Come, he managed to gasp. The king has called for you. Oh, you really are minstrels, drinking and washing water and leaving the beer. We don't exactly have an act, April muttered. We marched through the pushing, shoving, happily drunk throng. The crowd grew more and more dense as we approached the large building that dominated the center of town. Make way, Thoroff yelled, pushing common soldiers aside, roughly but without malice, and shouldering past officers. The proportion of officers grew as we progressed, so did the general level of drunkenness. I was a good head shorter than the average guy we passed, a head and a neck shorter than a lot of them, and most of them were armed. Suddenly we were shoved out into an open space. I hadn't even noticed when we passed within the great hall, but now I could see. It was like a model version of Loki's throne room. Timber walls that had been roughly plastered instead of Loki's stone. High wood roof supported by massive beams. Shields, all scarred, many with holes, hung from the top of the left wall. Along the right were various flags and banners, war trophies, I assumed, the shields and banners of enemies who hadn't done too well upon meeting the Norsemen, like something you'd see in a museum. Only these didn't represent some long-ago forgotten battle. Some of the bodies represented by these banners and shields still lay rotting in misty fields. Widows and orphans still living remembered the men who'd fallen behind these banners. In the center of the room was an open hearth the size of a small swimming pool. Smoke rose to a hole in the roof. The smell stayed behind, a smell of burning meat joining a smell of sweat and beer and smoke. It's like one of my brother's frat parties, Christopher said, in a shout that could barely be heard above the level of voices all around. Back from the fire, behind a clothed table sat a dozen or so Vikings. These were rich men, powerful men. Silver brooches, lush furs, polished leather, chains of silver baubles around their necks, elaborately filigreed silver goblets, silver-handled knives sticking out of the piles of meat before them. Some of the men at the table looked like punks. Drunk, glaring, mad at the world, don't make me kick your ass punks. Sadists. Psychos. But for the most part, they were sober. A bright-eyed looking crowd. They were swilling beer in something that came in smaller glasses, but they still looked clear-eyed enough. Then I recognized a face I knew. At the far end of the table, ignored by everyone, was the old man who had sacrificed the sheep. He looked at me. I looked at him. We both knew we'd seen each other before. I had to work to start breathing again. At the center of the table was a black man chewing at the edges of a slab of pink meat on a silver knife. Thorolf pulled us forward. "My king, minstrels are here." He said in a bellow that was normal conversational speech in this crowd. "They had better be good," King Olaf Ironfoot warned. He jerked the meat-laden knife toward one of the other Vikings to his left. "My good friend, King Eric the Grim, says his sword is hungry for blood." This evoked quite a bit of guffawing by all but Eric, who glared and said, "Would I dirty my sword with these gamesters? Better to throw them into the fire and hear their fat crackle in the flames as the sun worshippers do." Now an argument erupted. Another Viking said, "That's not the sun worshippers. My second wife was a princess of the sun worshippers. They did not burn men. They cut open their chests while alive and drew out their still beating hearts." This was accompanied by hand gestures and by rude asides from some of the others at the table. "Princess, my arse. She was a slave girl with a nice..." "They burned them too," Eric said, punctuating his statement by pounding on the table and making a burned pig jump. "They burn them and eat their bones." "Are you saying I'm a fool? That my second wife, mother of my eldest son, would dare lie to me?" Olaf held up a placating hand and even put down his knife. Worthy kings, there are 4 minstrels here. Enough for you, Eric, to burn, and for you, Hedrick, to cut out their hearts." Another fabulous witticism of Olaf in the place erupted into ha-ha-ha's. And what did he say? "Come, minstrels, juggle, jest, or recite the poems composed by your betters. If you amuse me, you will be well rewarded. And if not..." He looked around, building to the big joke. "If you do not, we must, in the spirit of fairness, cut out your hearts, and then roast you." The last time I tried to entertain anyone had been the ill-fated poem where Christopher had made everyone laugh. This was going to be worse. What passed for silence descended. In other words, there was a sort of lull in the mayhem. "April, sing something," Christopher said through gritted teeth. She stammered, "I..." The look in Olaf's eyes grew darker. He wasn't laughing anymore. "Give us a poem," he roared in a voice that rattled the roof timbers. I opened my mouth. 'Twas brillig, and the silthy toves did gyre and gimble and wave. All mimsy were the... "Do you seek to mock me?" He wasn't Loki, but he was doing a good impression. At this moment, it was Christopher who saved us. I don't know what moved him. I don't understand the brain that could do what he did next. But at that moment, he not only saved us, he gave us a hit. He stepped forward, he clenched his fist. His knees buckled, but he caught himself before he hit the floor, and in a loud voice, edged with hysteria, he sang, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the mighty Viking lords. They are trampling out the vineyards where the grapes of wrath are stored. They have loosed the fateful lightning of their terrible swift swords. The Vikes are marching on." He went through the glory, glory, hallelujah chorus with a few changes, and then stopped suddenly. The Norse kings were gaping. The crowd was silent, and then Olaf, his dark eyes ablaze, said, What do you call this manner of a poem? A song, Christopher said in soprano squeak. A song! Give us more, give us another verse. Only start back at the beginning. There's a second verse? Christopher asked me, his eyes desperate. Starting at the beginning was easy enough, and Jaleel, April, and I joined in, more or less tunefully belting out the chorus. But how was Christopher going to come up with a second verse? We jumped aboard our longboats and we sailed upon the seas. We slaughtered all who fought us and we did just as we pleased. 'Cause we're crazy Viking warriors and we never beg for peace. April jumped in. The Vikes are marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. We all sang, Lordy, how we'll stick it to ya. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The Vikes are marching on. Pandemonium. Foot stomping, fist pounding, yelling, bellowing, roaring, approval. Some of the drunker ones were trying to repeat the lyrics, struggling to catch the tune. Christopher shot me a grin. We own these guys. And that's when the crowd parted and 4 massive trolls walked in. All right. So it looks like our heroes are doing pretty well for themselves, all things considered. But we will have to wait until next time, which should be Sunday if I don't forget. I'm sorry. Sunday for bedtime stories, we will find out what happens with these trolls. And also, have y'all noticed? We are more than halfway through this book. Ooh, it's gonna be so good. Well, I hope y'all have a good day. It's my partner Joshua's birthday, so tell him happy birthday. Happy birthday, Joshua. And I will see y'all next time. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate y'all.